And different ways of learning about competitors, and we discussed some of these in the seminars, and we had 5, 6 seminars in the second week, last week. And we identified different ways, mainly looking at benchmarking. I think with 2 or 3 groups discussed benchmarking on how you might do that. But there are other ways of trying to learn from competitors rather than just simply analyse them in some way, other than simply R&D. Reverse engineering, if you have a physical product, that's easier than if you have a service. But you can still reverse engineer a service. You can try to experience the service and then trying to understand how that service is delivered and what they do better or worse. And do you remember in some of these seminar groups we discussed value curves? You can draw a value curve of you against them and figure out where you're superior or where you're deficient. And that works really well in services. But in manufactured goods, often the first thing you do, a new product comes out of a competitor, you will literally reverse engineer it to say, what's new, who are the suppliers, what's the IP in there, what can we learn from this? Okay? So, physically doing that. But in services, it's slightly more subtle. Other ways of learning from competitors is licensing. If they will grant you a license, then there is usually, above and beyond the legal contractual relationship, there is usually then a disclosure of intellectual property. Yeah? So it's not just a legal right to use it, but also there's disclosure about how you do it. So that's quite difficult with direct competitors, but sometimes you'll get the licensing agreement because the competitors compete on a different basis. So the competitor might compete on brand or availability or size, so they're quite willing to, say, license some of the technology because that's not what they compete on. Okay, so it's certainly a smart way, and we'll spend a whole session looking at IP, intellectual property. It's very powerful. You can hire employees from another company. So when Kodak tried to diversify, it was paying premium price to hire people from software and electronics companies to try to very quickly get R&D capability in that particular digital imaging. It wasn't terribly successful, but it was their strategy to do that. Okay. Depending on what the type of knowledge is, and we haven't spoken much about different types of knowledge yet, and we'll spend half a session looking at knowledge types, but depending on the type of knowledge, if it's a sort of knowledge in the jargon that's codified, it means it's in books, online, things that you can read, and digest, then you can sort of scan conference proceedings, go to conferences, journals, and things like that systematically. So you can learn like secondary learning, so you're not directly from the competitors, but areas they're publishing in, either publicly or otherwise, and you can begin to do that. But that only works where you have highly codified knowledge, where you have very tacit systemic knowledge, which we'll talk about another session. It's not possible to do that because you can't capture it. Patent disclosures, we'll also take some time talking about. That's different to licensing. Licensing is a legal contract. I grant you certain rights to use this, okay, in return for something, and that return could be money or a percentage or something or whatever. We'll talk about that when we look at licensing. Patent disclosures are different. When you're granted a patent, by definition, it's in the public domain. In fact, even when you apply for a patent, it's in the public domain. So either for a small fee, depending on which country you're in, or for nothing, you just do a few clicks and you can look at that patent or that patent application. So the downside of going for a patent is it's publicly disclosed. So somebody could imitate it or copy it, if they're willing to take that risk. And that's a very common source of learning, where technology and patents are important. Looking at patent disclosures, perhaps with a view to a licensing deal, perhaps not, is a very common way of generating knowledge. Or it could be working with either consultants or with employees of an innovating firm. Example is lots of joint ventures, and we'll spend a session looking at open innovation, alliances, joint ventures. But a lot of joint ventures, the purpose of joint venture, at least partially, is to learn. Yes, so teams work together, and at least one of the partners is trying to learn from the other team and company. And we'll give some examples of that later. So joint ventures, alliances are all often an opportunity to learn something. And that could be commercial, it could be technical, or it could be about production or process. Yeah? Okay, so a whole range of ways where we can not just say, who are our competitors, how do we destroy them, but say, how can we learn something from these competitors in some way. And there's a whole range, remember we said in the seminars, a whole range of methods or tools or techniques. Yeah, so it's not an abstract idea. You can actually go about, what's the best way of learning? And some of these we spoke about, publications, benchmarking, and there's a whole range of things. Lead users, we mentioned earlier. Scenarios are a forecasting technique, which one or two of the groups identified last week, and we'll spend a session on forecasting, looking at that. QFD was also mentioned in some of the seminars. There's a whole range of explicit techniques we can use to try to learn, not just from competitors, but from other organisations. Okay? And these are often central when you look at